Also wenn Sie noch den Versuch starten wollen,
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to BDI. I'm Julia Friedlander, the CEO of Atlantik-Brücke here in Berlin, and I'm really proud that we're doing this cooperative project together between the BDI, the German Banking Federation, and of course my organization. It's a particular honor to welcome Deputy Secretary here today due to my own background in the US government, so it's a little bit like coming home. I would have essentially served on his team a couple of years ago working on Russia sanctions myself. The US and European and especially G7 unity, as we've experienced over the past couple of years, has been a remarkable event in transatlantic cooperation, in global cooperation, and an exercise of plurilateral economic statecraft. But as we've seen over the past couple of years as well, the smarter we get, the smarter the others get in turn. And I think we're here today to discuss tricky issues on the table today where economic statecraft becomes a little bit of a field and a sticky beast, and we have important decisions to make. So I anticipate that today our discussion will be a little bit about China, but a little bit about Russia as well, and the connection between those two, looking at the witting or maybe not so witting intersection between Chinese institutions and military production and Russia's war economy. It's my pleasure to welcome the Deputy Secretary, also Ambassadors Gittenstein and Gutman. And I would like to just turn the floor over to Wally, but I think he's stepped out. He's right, oh, you're right here. Oh my goodness.
Well, let me thank Julie for that kind introduction, and depart from my remarks just for a moment to thank my two favorite ambassadors for being here today. Our ambassador to Germany, our ambassador to the EU. And this is not hyperbole. I can't think of two Americans who have done more to deepen the transatlantic relationship than both of them. And we are both on the American side and on the European side indebted to your service. So thank you for that. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. I must also thank our host for having me today. And I have to especially thank our ambassador to Germany, because I have visited Germany more than any other country in my time as Deputy Secretary. And seeing my counterparts, some of them said today, "You're back again." And I think the reason I'm here is because of the depth of our relationship on so many fronts, from the economic to climate to national security. The United States and German interest overlap in so many ways. And the depth of our alliance isn't just based on those issues, but it's on the shared values of our people, including a deep and abiding commitment to freedom and to democracy. And while I'm here today to talk about economic issues and the use of our economic tools, I think it's critical that we remember that fundamentally the reason that we are here, the reason we care so deeply about what happens in Ukraine, what happens around the world, is because of those shared values. As many of you know, I'm here in Germany on my way back from a trip to Kyiv, where I had a chance to meet with my Ukrainian counterparts, but also to meet brave Ukrainian people. And that trip reminded me of something that we all know to be true, something that we saw early on in this war, but that we still see every day. That the only reason that Ukraine remains a democratic country is because of the willingness of the Ukrainian people to fight for their freedom. Ultimately, that freedom and those values are the same ones that are at the core of each of our countries. And we all remember, over 2 years ago, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin believed that they would have Kyiv within days, that they would have taken the entire country within a few weeks. But Ukraine stood up, and our alliance and our coalition stood beside them, denying the Kremlin the quick victory that they expected. And as the Ukrainian people fought off Russian troops, we put in place unprecedented sanctions, cutting off Russia's largest banks, but also immobilizing Russia's war bounty, their sovereign assets that were held in all of our countries that they hoped would help finance this war of choice in Ukraine. In response to this strategic failure, and we have to remember and remind ourselves always that for Russia, this was, in fact, a strategic failure. They doubled down, committing the vast majority of their troops to a war in Ukraine that they thought they would have won within weeks, but also putting in place a set of draconian capital controls that stopped assets and later on individuals from being able to leave Russia. And as Russia decided to change their strategy, our response also changed. On one end, the United States, Germany, and our coalition provided Ukraine with weapons to defend against Russia's aggression and economic support to bolster the Ukrainian economy. On the other hand, we took steps to isolate Russia from the global financial system and cut off the Kremlin's access to the goods they needed to build the weapons that they wanted. Simultaneously, we went after Russia's main revenue source through a price cap that reduced the revenue that Russia made from selling its most profitable product, its oil. And to look to our success, we need to not only look at the data that demonstrates that we've had an impact on Russia, but Putin's own spokesperson said openly that our actions are impeding Russians' ability to get access to the goods they need and limiting their profits in meaningful ways. And throughout this, a cornerstone of our strategy has been to focus on one key objective, which is taking steps to force the Kremlin to make hard choices between preserving their economy and continuing to fund their war of choice. Well, today we know the Kremlin has made a choice. At every stage, it has chosen to wage its illegal war over investing in the Russian people. Putin has largely decided to turn Russia into a war economy, where the entire industrial base is geared towards his war of choice in Ukraine. Gone is a commitment to building a prosperous Russian middle class connected to the world and expanding opportunity in his country. In its place, the Kremlin is instead creating an economy inspired by the Soviet era, prioritizing guns over butter and military ambition over the welfare of its citizens. Within this economy, the Kremlin is now allocating 29% of Russia's total budget this year for defense spending. That is more than double what it spent in 2021. Production of military industrial goods has risen by 35%. To do this, Russia is depleting its economic buffers, draining its foreign exchange, and driving up inflation. And Russians are speaking with their feet. Over 1 million working-age Russians have either fled the country or have been conscripted into fighting into Putin's war in Ukraine, limiting the productive capacity of their economy in meaningful ways. Meanwhile, Russia is nationalizing a wave of companies, including a leading auto trade manufacturer, chemical companies, and metal producers. And the international private sector exodus shows no sign of reversing as Russia has revealed itself to be a trade partner that you cannot trust. Beyond the data, you can see the Russian economy transforming in small but illustrative ways. A Russian bakery stopped making desserts and now is producing drones. A company that made camping gear for hikers pivoted making sleeping bags for soldiers. Perhaps the clearest example to date of Putin's focus on building out a war economy was his replacement of his defense secretary with an economic advisor, whose sole goal is to make sure that the Russian economy is capable of producing the weapons that Vladimir Putin needs for the wars that he wants. And throughout this war in Ukraine, our actions have focused on making it difficult for these economic choices to take place in Russia. First, we forced them to accept the choice between geopolitical isolation of their financial system and waging their war. Now, the choice is between abandoning his domestic economic priorities and prolonging this war. And each time that Russia makes the choice to prolong the war, we have to adapt the strategy and approach we take as a coalition. We must recognize that while Russia's economy's reconfiguration into a wartime economy will have a detrimental impact on the Russian people, it has the potential to make the Russian military stronger than it was before the war started. It's important for us all to recognize Russia's ambition is not just to recreate the military that they had before they invaded Ukraine. It's to build a military that is a direct threat to NATO, to our national security, and that is why this war in Ukraine is not just an existential threat to Ukraine, it's an existential threat to NATO, to Europe, to the United States. That is why we need to focus at this moment on making sure that Russia doesn't have the weapons it wants to fight the war that it now desperately needs to win in Ukraine. This includes looking to expand our sanctions and export controls regimes to capture the fact that Russia's entire economy is now on war footing. We have to also remember that for Russia to be successful, it needs to build a military industrialized complex that relies on supplies. Before the war, Russia relied on companies, many of them represented in this room and in my country and across our alliance, for the goods it needed to build heavy machinery. For decades, Russia was able to integrate into our economies, but as soon as this war started, we took a number of steps to limit Russia's ability to get those goods from our countries. at a cost to many of our companies, the cost that our companies bore out of their patriotic duty, but also out of a clear understanding that stopping Russia from being able to be successful in Ukraine would mean that Russia would not be in a position to continue to destabilize Europe and to impact our national security. Our choice to cut off Russia left them with very few choices. And they've chosen their partners now. Those include Iran, North Korea, and particularly China. Last year, Russia imported $5.2 billion worth of sensitive dual-use goods from China-based suppliers, an increase of over 40%. This is because the Kremlin knows it can only meet its military goals, frankly, with Chinese assistance. This is why President Putin chose to make his first trip after re-election to China. It's why he toured Harbin Institute of Technology, which is known for research on items such as rockets, missiles, and UAVs, and which recently opened a joint campus with St. Petersburg State University. No other country, despite what China would tell us, has the capacity to supply Russia with the quantity of machine tools, microelectronics, engine parts, and other goods the Kremlin needs to build its weapons of choice. Beijing may not be sending tanks and missiles to Russia, but the Kremlin cannot produce these weapons at scale or continue its war without assistance from companies and financial institutions in China. In addition, many of the goods our coalition countries are producing that are still being found on the battlefield, and when I was in Ukraine recently, they raised this with me, are being transshipped through China. There is, of course, more that we can and should do to make sure that our goods are not ending up on the battlefield, and I know that our companies and our countries are committed to doing that. But I want to be clear that our goal here is not to shut down the bilateral economic relationship between China and Russia. Our goal is to convince China to stop sending Russia a set of dual-use goods that are actively being used to prosecute a war Beijing has told the world it wants to end. We provided China and other countries with the list of these goods, and many of those other countries have chosen to stop providing those goods to the Russians. But instead, Russia and China's partnership continues to deepen. And this partnership may seem like a distant threat to our companies and to our countries. But we should remember that before the war started, we often talked about our concerns with Europe's dependence on Russian gas and the need to diversify supply chains. That too was once a distant threat. But the consequences of our inaction became apparent when Russia weaponized its energy, thinking that by doing that, they could convince Europe to give up on its support for Ukraine. But because of the bravery of Europeans and the innovation of German companies and companies throughout Europe, we withstood that pressure. But once again, there are warning signs flashing for us now. This time, because of China's support for the Russian military-industrialized complex. We should not be blind to the fact that a growing Russian military, with material support from Chinese companies, will only grow the Kremlin's ambition. That's why we have to be explicit with every individual, company, and country that provides the Russian military-industrialized complex with support that it is completely unacceptable. And this needs to start at home, as I mentioned, including with companies in our own countries. As I mentioned, the Ukrainians raised with me directly why American-made goods or labeled goods and European labeled goods are being found on the battlefield. And while it is true that many of them are being transshipped through China, there is clearly more that we can, we must, and we will do in the United States, working closely with our manufacturers, distributors, and freight forwarding firms to build out compliance regimes that help to better track these goods and prevent them from being transshipped into Russia. And I know that Germany and others in Europe are committed to doing the same, and we must act. But we should never confuse ourselves from the fact that ultimately In order for Russia to succeed at its war of choice, it needs a large-scale partner, and the only country capable of providing that partnership is China. Every country in NATO and our coalition must consistently communicate clearly to the Chinese and to Beijing that it's unacceptable for China to provide Russia with these dual-use goods that they need. President Biden, Secretary Blinken, Secretary Yellen, and a number of European leaders have already done this. And while our words matter, our actions often matter more. The EU as a whole is China's largest export market, and China remains the largest exporter in key sectors like chemicals and machinery to the EU. And I recognize the EU's economic relationship with China is mutually beneficial and significant. And we must make clear to the Chinese that Chinese firms can either do business in our economies, or they can equip Russia's war machinery with dual-use goods. They can't continue to do both. We must make clear to Chinese companies that we are all prepared to use our sanctions and export controls to hold them accountable. And the United States, Europe, and all of our allies have to act together in following through by using our economic tools so that there is no daylight between our policies. Of course, our preference is to not have to use these tools. Our economies are intertwined with China's. We do not seek to decouple from China. We want a healthy economic relationship with China that benefits both sides. This is possible. It's something we should strive for. It's something we should remain focused on. But if China does not stop providing these dual-use goods to Russia, we must hold them accountable because our national security is at stake. And I recognize, as an economic official, that if we're forced to take these steps, many in this room and across our countries and our coalition may worry about the economic repercussions to our companies and our economies. But my view is that failure to convince China to stop selling dual-use goods to Russia poses a significant threat to Europe's national security, to global security, which in turn will disrupt our economic efforts far more. A resurgent, militarized, and mobilized Russia would mean greater geopolitical challenges to our economies. It would mean greater threats of economic coercion, and it would mean through tougher and harder trade-offs between our defense spending and our priorities at home. When President Putin was in China, he said cooperation between the PRC and Russia serve as one of the main stabilizing factors in the international arena. I'm doubtful that many in this room think that an emboldened Russia would be stabilizing for Germany, for Europe, for the United States, or the global economy. That a Russian victory in Ukraine would be an economically preferable outcome for any of us. That's why we have to take concerted efforts today and over the next several weeks and months to make sure that Russia doesn't have the ability to build the weapons it wants to fight this war in Ukraine. And we don't have endless time to deliberate. The Russian military industrialized complex is growing in size because Putin has gone all in. He is confident that with a reconfigured economy, he can overpower Ukraine and challenge NATO. His confidence stems from the fact that he thinks he can wait us out, that our support for Ukraine will wane, and that we will grow complacent in our response to this aggression. And I want to be clear that I recognize that the actions that we have taken collectively throughout our coalition have come at a cost. We've always been guided by a North Star that the cost to Russia must be greater than to the cost to our economies and to our companies. And that's what we're committed to continuing to do, to working closely with you because we know that our companies also care deeply about our national security. And fundamentally, we have the ability, we have the will, we have the capability to do what we have done for the last 2 years, which is prove Vladimir Putin wrong and stand together with the people of Ukraine. I look forward to our conversation, but I look forward to finding ways to also deepen our alliance and partnership in service of those shared values. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the conversation.
So also from my side, a very warm welcome to you. It's a pleasure to have you here again. Thank you for your ongoing support for the transatlantic relation, and we are very lucky to have you here. I had the opportunity to talk to you in January last time. It was a really interesting debate, so I'm very happy that we can ongo this discussion today. My name is Heiner Herkenhoff. I'm CEO of the Association of German Banks, and I would like to pose some questions to you and then probably open the floor for questions from the audience. So first of all, thank you for the speech you gave. It was really clear, and thank you for the clear messages you gave, and it became clear how important sanctions are in the current global context. Banks, and that I can say, play an important role in enforcing the sanctions you were talking about. On both sides of the Atlantic, banks have excelled in the implementation of sanctions against Russia. Let me make it very clear. I can say that German banks are compliant. We appreciate that G7 sanctions against Russia are largely synchronized, which increases their political impact. However, the sanctions we are now facing, the regime against Russia and others, is quite complex. It's complex for companies, it's complex for banks, and it's even complex for the administration and supervisors. Clear, reliable, and consistent rules on both sides of the Atlantic are therefore essential. This will reduce the complexity, but above all, we ensure that we hit the right entities. And of course, we need a strong cooperation between the US and the EU to make all this a success. So here's my first question. What can we do to ensure that the US and the EU continue to pull together in the future? This is with regard to sanctions, to tariffs, and probably to a long-term strategy on both sides of the Atlantic.
Well, let me say what I started with, which is that fundamentally the only way that our sanctions and export controls work is through a partnership with the private sector. And I can think of no period in which that partnership has been stronger, both in terms of your willingness to enforce these sanctions, but to come to us with questions and suggestions in terms of the way that we can do this better. My view is that one of the most important things we can do as a coalition is make sure that we are implementing in a way that reduces the compliance burden for firms. I've had a chance to meet with government officials here in Germany, and one of the things we talked about was how can we make sure that what we're doing is consistent throughout our jurisdictions, because the hardest challenge that banks often face in my conversations is when we try in our jurisdictions to do the exact same things, but we do it slightly differently, and then you have to put in place 3 different compliance regimes given that. So one of the things that we are increasingly going to focus on is how do we make sure that when we take similar actions, they look the same from a compliance standpoint. And 2, as we think about taking actions, one of the things that we do specifically in the United States that I think we have to continue to do throughout the coalition is make sure that we're doing a cost analysis to make sure that the cost to Russia is far larger than the cost to our firms and our companies. But I recognize that that cost analysis is often better informed when we have direct conversations with industry, because you understand the economic ties and the global economic system sometimes far better than we do. So part of what we've done in the United States, and I think we've done across our jurisdictions, is have an open door to hear from you in terms of what the risks are and how, if we're going to take an action, can we design them better. But I think that more to the broader point, part of this for us is not only better coordination when it comes to using some of these coercive tools against actors like Russia, but how can we deepen the transatlantic economic relationship? Because fundamentally, it's a bedrock of our relationship, and there's more that I think we can do there. One area where I think this is true at the moment is when it comes to climate change. Here, from our standpoint, we need a strong, diversified industrial base here in Germany and in Europe that is helping to build out the climate economy of the future. We're doing that in the United States. One of the things that we've advocated for is a critical minerals agreement between the United States and Europe, which from my standpoint will serve as the basis of a deeper relationship around how do we build economy around the climate change evolution that we're making throughout the global economy that will serve our 2 jurisdictions. Fundamentally today, China dominates the clean energy ecosystem, both in terms of minerals, but also in terms of production. And we want to be very clear that we think that we in no way want to stop China from participating in that. We may want them to take steps that mean that they will compete with us on a level playing field, but ultimately we want to make sure that European companies and American companies have the ability to compete here as well. The only way we can do that is if we build a supply chain that is built on our values. And I think this is a place where we can deepen our relationship by coming to an agreement that is the basis of that, but having our companies work more closely together. When I think about the pandemic, which was, I think, we don't speak about it as much, but fundamentally, when we took office, we were in the throes of this pandemic. The only reason the pandemic ended when it did was because of a partnership between an American-based company and a German-based company. We need more of that in this world because fundamentally our business communities working together is one of the ways that we're going to get the type of innovation we need to solve challenges like climate change. And I think that our governments can do more to build the foundations that allow that to be possible.
Yeah, as you can see on the tapestry behind you, we are two strong organizations, the TBI and the Atlantik-Brücke, and we are really very much engaged for a strong transatlantic partnership. So this is music in our ears. So as you said, we need to be economically strong and attractive and competitive. And on the other hand, we have sanctions, we have tariffs and other things. How can we make sure that this sanction regime doesn't hit the competitiveness and the relationship, the economic relationship internationally too much?
And I think that comes back to, the way that we think about the use of these sanctions. And I think we have to always think through how can we do it in a multilateral way? Because I think that fundamentally taking multilateral action does two things. It means that we are relying on not only our political strength as an alliance, but frankly, our economic strength. Right now, the coalition of countries that are working together to hold Russia accountable represent about 40 to 50% of GDP. But they also represent the world's foremost convertible currencies as well. By acting together, it also means that our companies can't be singled out. So that's part of the reason why I think both when it comes to everything from sanctions to thinking about our trade policies, us acting together makes a great deal of sense. One of the challenges we have that you all know is that we have different tools and our competencies are different. Some of yours are jurisdictionally belong to the EU, others are member state, but fundamentally having a shared purpose and then working towards it using our various tools, I think is one of the best ways to protect our economic competitiveness. But I think we also have to be very clear about the fact that we need to do what it takes to protect our national security, but that does not need to come at the cost of our economy. I think it can help reinforce the economic values we share. I think the biggest place where that is in focus for all of us has to be when it comes to energy security. It's a fundamental issue for all of us. It drives our competitiveness. And here, part of the reason that we have to make the clean energy transition isn't only because of climate change, but because it provides us with greater energy security in the future. Those investments are critical to be made, and one country can't make enough of them alone to help deal with climate change or to deal with energy security. So I think from my standpoint, better coordination is key here, but also using a formula where we think about economic considerations as we use some of these tools like sanctions is also critical to our success of holding bad actors accountable, but also making sure that we limit the impact on our economies.
It seems to me we're heading towards a new world order, probably with two blocks again. And this will come with more sanctions and probably more tariffs and other things. And this will probably hamper the old economic order. How can we make sure that this one makes it not too complicated and doesn't harm the competitiveness of both sides? As you already mentioned, the US and Europe are closely working together, especially Germany and the US are very deep and strong relationship. How can we make clear that this is true for the future?
And I think that this is a popularly held view that I frankly don't agree with. I don't think we're heading towards a new world order that's bifurcated because it doesn't make sense for either side. I tried to make this clear in my speech. Ultimately, we don't want to bifurcate from China. We want a healthy economic relationship with them because it's to our benefit, frankly, but it's also to their benefit. We are China's two largest trading partners. But what we do want, and I think we have to be clear about what we want and what we need, is we need them when it comes to trade issues to compete on a level playing field. How we get there is something where I think we're having open discussions, but I thought the statement that the G7 finance ministers made about overcapacity was an important one. It's one similar to one that Hendrik Roller and I negotiated over a decade ago when we were G7 Sherpas, but it's still a challenge that we need to address together as our countries to make sure that China is playing by a level playing field. And then when it comes to national security, we have to be clear and speak with one voice when we're not only talking to the Chinese, but talking to other countries. But I fundamentally believe that the economic system that was built post-World War II continues to be the most dominant one in the world, and it's one that other countries want to participate in because it's fundamentally to their benefit. The way we keep them thinking that that is true is based on the investments we make in our economies and the fact that our economies continue to grow and our consumers continue to be placed to be people that they want to sell things to. So my sense is that that has less to do with what we do with our sanctions, even though we need to make sure that we are using those precise, but more about what we do in terms of investing in our economies and building the types of economies that are attracted to those countries in order to make sure that they want to invest their dollars and they want to make sure that their companies have access to our consumers.
Yes, thank you. Russia, we talked about sanctions to China, we talked about sanctions to Russia. As we can see, Russia responded to Western sanctions with their own sizing assets and especially for international banks. And several lawsuits are still pending. So leaving Russia means in many cases for banks, for example, to leave their assets behind and to leave them, we could say, already as a gift. This is not what we want to do. So how can the West effectively prevent or counter such measures from Russia to prevent that we should have effects that we don't want to have?
I think we have to acknowledge to ourselves and be open about the fact that Russia is not a democracy. We may call these things that are happening in Russia court cases, but we have to admit to ourselves that they are sham court cases. That when Vladimir Putin wants to take your assets, he's going to take your assets. That's a choice that he's going to make. And that is part of the problem we face, that unlike our countries where we have the rule of law, where we are going to take steps that are consistent with the rule of law, Russia is not going to do so. So when they put in place those draconian capital controls, they didn't go to our financial institutions and say, well, we're going to do this, go ahead and remove your assets before we lock the doors. They lock the doors on you, and now they're going to take our assets. So I think part of what we're doing, and this is not just European financial institutions, they're American financial institutions that are in the same place, is doing everything we can to make sure that we protect the ability for us to do the limited legitimate trade that is allowed with Russia. But I think that we have to admit to ourselves that Putin is going to do what is in Russia's self-interest. They're not going to follow international law in doing so. And that likely means that our companies are going to suffer because of that. But I don't know that there's anything that we can do that would in some way limit Putin's ability to do whatever he wants to do with those assets that are in his country. But regardless of what he does, I think the thing that we have control over is what we do. And what we're going to do is continue to follow international law, to make clear when we are taking actions against Russia, why we're doing it and how we're doing it, and work to make sure that we protect our financial firms from risks that we can control, and work very closely with you to better understand the risks that you face from your businesses in Russia as well. But I think that I don't think we should be of the view that we can do much to stop Putin and the Russian system from taking actions they want to do, including taking assets that don't belong to them.
Thank you. You talked about the lessons the Russians learned from the sanctions the West put on them. What is your view on the lessons probably the Chinese have learned during the last few years with regard to the sanctions?
And I want to be clear with regard to what we've seen. We've seen that the vast majority of big, globally interconnected firms in China are actually following our sanctions because they fundamentally care more about their business with our countries than they do about their small and growing smaller business with Russia. So I think the important thing for us, and the thing that they've asked us in our communications with the Chinese private sector or some of their big state-owned firms, is the same thing that you're asking, which is clarity. Just tell us who we can and we can't do business with. Ultimately, our view is that those big Chinese firms, it is better for them to take steps that are consistent with our sanctions and our export controls, because we too want to continue to have the ability to do business with them. But I do think that one of the challenges that we face is that in China there is huge private sector that includes medium-sized firms and small firms, which we have in our countries as well. And there, we need the government to help us put in place a regime that stops them from being able to take advantage of a system where, because Russia no longer is buying these things from our countries that they used to buy, now they're trying to buy them from companies in China, but companies in other places as well. They're doing it in Turkey, they're doing it all over the world. And we know that for a fact that the Kremlin has tasked their intelligence services with setting up front companies and intermediaries that will help them get around our sanctions and convince companies in other countries to sell them goods. So I think from my standpoint, what we've seen is that the biggest sophisticated, globally interconnected Chinese firms recognize the importance of following our sanctions, because ultimately for them, when they think about their profits and what they're doing to maintain those, they need to be able to continue to do business with us, which gets to my first point, which is that ultimately for China, for the United States, for Germany, for our entire coalition, there is a huge degree of interest in continuing to have deep bilateral relationships. The thing we have to provide to the Chinese is clarity about where we stand with regard to some of the things that they're doing.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes left. Probably there are some questions from the audience. Please give me a hand. Please say your name and the organization you're here for.
Ulrich Sante, I'm the Vice Chairman of the Landesbank Baden-Württemberg, one of Germany's largest banks. We've so far been looking very much at the war Russia is faring against Ukraine. We've been looking at the bilateral relationship between China, Russia, North Korea, Iran versus the West. I would like to direct our attention to the global South, a number of countries that is growing in importance, growing in self-esteem, becoming more and more important for us with regard to their resources, but also playing a game which we cannot really control with regard to the sanctions regime that we've so far been talking about. My question to you is there any sort of strategy that you can offer us here, the US government is perhaps working on, either as transatlantic partners or as G7 or even within the group of G20, on how we can deal with the global South that we need to be on our side if we really want to preserve the international rules-based order, for example, so, and their financial needs with regard to infrastructure, what have you. Is there any sort of strategy that you have to gain their hearts and minds for us?
Maybe we could take another question so you can answer to Jan, please.
Hi, I'm Jan Kalmorgen. I run Global Political Advisory at EY. Can I ask you if you have can you identify Chinese companies that provide dual-use goods to Russia? Is that possible to nail that down? And is there a list that you share and also share with, like, say, European industry that they have a chance to understand the critical points?
So let me take both of those questions. And the second question first, which is, we have sanctioned a number of Chinese companies that we think are providing these dual-use goods. And I think one thing we've also done is we've provided a list of the dual-use goods that we're concerned about. And I think that companies should be aware of those things, both our sanctions list, but also that list of dual-use goods that we are worried about, and look at their supply chains and their customers to identify who is either producing these things and maybe selling them to China, but also which firms we've sanctioned, and increase and improve their due diligence over these things. The truth is that the only way our sanctions and export controls work is if you are willing to enforce them and to frankly do some due diligence on your end. And most of your firms have went above and beyond, and I have to say that especially about the banking sector. The places, frankly, that I am increasingly more worried is about mid-size and small firms in all of our countries, including mine, because they tend to have less sophisticated compliance structures because they can invest less in it. And what we know is that the Russian intelligence services are trying to take advantage of this. So as you think about your customers in your country, and I'm telling my financial institution this as well, think about the ones who are smaller and mid-size, but who are producing critical components that the Russians need that are part of that list. And I'm asking that those of you which are big firms, both inform them, but help them find out if there are all of a sudden a large increase in their shipments to a stand of one good that has just come out of nowhere. That's a typology that we're seeing happen all over. So we could use your help in looking at that. I really appreciate the question about what we do with regard to the Global South, because I think this is a critically important thing, not only with regard to as we think about some of these geopolitical issues, but to our economic future. There is no way that we're able to deal with and find the critical minerals we need for the climate transition without working closely with these countries in the Global South. But I think that's an opportunity, not a challenge, because fundamentally they have done deals with the Chinese that have not worked out for them in the ways that they want to, which I see as an opportunity. And one initiative out of many that is happening in the G7 is called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure, where our countries have come together to say that we are going to work across our development finance agencies and across our governments to invest in infrastructure in these countries in the hope that by investing in that infrastructure, we can help their economies develop. But ultimately, by us investing in that infrastructure, it will give our companies the ability to then compete on a level playing field for deals in those countries for some of these critical minerals. What we've seen is what China has done, because their private sector is not separated from their government, is that oftentimes if they go out and they buy either mining rights or offtake rights, they also build the railroad, build the port in order to take those things away. But unlike what we're doing through the Partnership for Global Infrastructure, where we're saying that yes, we want to build this in order to allow companies to be able to take offtake, but we're also going to build it in ways so that communities have access to these roads, to these railroads. Oftentimes, the Chinese will only build that railroad straight to the port from their mine, and they will not make sure. So I think part of this is not only us making investments in those communities through things like PGII and other formats, but also making sure those investments are done in ways that are inclusive in those communities. But one of the things I think that we lack, that we need the private sector's help with, is capital. And what we can do is create incentives to draw in private capital. And I know some of the things you worry about is how do we deal with FX risk? How do we think about political risk in these countries? And we can work with you in terms of thinking about designing these tools, because ultimately, in order to meet the infrastructure needs, not only in our countries, but around the world, it's going to take private capital. But that private capital probably needs incentives. We're, through the World Bank, through other agencies, happy to do that work. But ultimately, it's going to require the private sector to lean in, which you've proven capable and willing to do. But it is a major area of focus for us, because I think it is the way that we can compete with what a number of countries like China has done, which is providing resources to these countries that are desperate for those resources, but on terms that they are finding do not work for them, which I think creates real opportunity for us.
Okay, we have a few minutes left. 3 questions. Professor Röller, please, the first one, then you, and then Anthony.
Wally, nice to see you. I think your last point I was going to ask about the private investment, the leveraging. We've been talking in the G7, as you know, a number of years about that. I think it's really important that we get going on that one. My question was more, you talked about the North Star and the cost issue. The cost calculation should cost more to Russia than to us. And sort of looking at it from the outside, and you've been making some points in your speech on that, I wonder. And I think we need to do much more in that direction, as you were saying in your speech. So you look at the IMF forecast, which you've seen for Russia, I think it's 3.2% is the average of the world growth. I think the US is probably comparable. In Germany, 0.2 for a number of different reasons, actually. So, if we do better, some of the things you mentioned in your speech, do you expect sort of the Russian economy to tank over the next few years, or how do you see that?
So I'll take that one, then we did the show. And the answer to that is no. I don't think that the way that we should measure our success when it comes to Russia is GDP or where the ruble is, because our goal is really to focus on their ability to build weapons and go after the supply chain for their military industrialized complex. Ultimately, Vladimir Putin has more than enough money to prop up his economy over the next several years because they're a commodity exporter and they've stored up a great deal of money. So when you look at it, though, and you look under GDP, where is that money going? It's 70% growth in their spending on the military industrialized complex. For the first time since the Soviet era, they're spending more on weapons than they are on investing in their people. So from my standpoint, the elements of our success is not whether their GDP goes down to zero, but rather what's happening with their ability to import critical goods to building weapons. I think the CBR just put out some data recently that showed that due to some actions that we took at the end of last year with putting in place a new executive order, they'd seen imports of some of these critical goods drop by up to 33%. To me, those are the types of measures we should look at as to whether we're successful, because fundamentally what they're doing is they are spending a great deal of money, which is driving up inflation, which is also mean they've had to significantly increase interest rates in their economy, and they also have tremendous capital controls. So it's hard for us to take the traditional measures of economic success and to hold them as the avenues of our success with Russia. And if our aim were to just simply go after GDP and the ruble, we'd be missing what I think is our key focus, which is stopping them from getting the weapons they need for the war in Ukraine.
Okay, we're running a little bit out of time. We have 2 more questions. Please put it very short.
Hello, my name is Julia Reinhardt. I'm here for NVIDIA. I really appreciate Mr. Santos' question about the Global South, but I would like to even enlarge our the number of countries we talk here about, also showing our global commitments, our Taiwan. And I know this is part of the China discussion. It's mainly about economic sanctions, and NVIDIA follows those diligently. Our CEO is in Taiwan right now. He's been greeted as a native Taiwanese, but also representative of an important US company with a big presence in Germany and Europe. When you look at Taiwan politically, what is your message to Europeans, and also maybe on the people you've talked to at the beginning of your trip?
Antonin, last question.
Thank you. Antonin Finkelberg from the German Wholesale and Foreign Trade Association. You spoke about common values, Germany, US, Europe, US. So why is it so hard for us to find together economically, especially given the TTC state of being stuck in the mud?
I think both my answers relate to my answer to both those questions are very related. And I think fundamentally the thing that I say to my European counterparts about Taiwan is that this is a place that shares our values. Ultimately, this is about giving people the ability to express their free will. My sense here is that Taiwan and the Taiwanese economy matters a great deal to us. It matters a great deal to China. It matters a great deal to the global economy. And we want to make sure that they have the ability to express that their free will. But to the question of what is, and I would say that our global cooperation can, of course, always increase. But I would suppose that today, the United States relationship and closeness with our closest ally, the European Union, is better than it's been in my time in public policy. We need to continue to grow it. And I think some of the things that we could do to do that, just to give you my short list, is one, we need to find a way to work closer and better together on these issues related to the clean energy future. That is the future of our economies. We need to come to some kind of agreement that talks about not just supply chains, but how we can innovate together, because innovation is going to be critical to this. Two is I think there are things that Europe needs to do. One of them that we've talked about is the capital markets union. Fundamentally, Europe should have a well-functioning capital markets that are deep, that are broad, that allow you to develop some of the great companies that you have here in Europe, that will allow you to build companies that will compete with American companies. Ultimately, you already have many global champions. You should have far more. And then I think finally, the third point is we do need to come to a shared understanding in terms of what we're going to do on issues of overcapacity. We have a major challenge that we faced for more than a decade off and on, which is now the world's second biggest economy is one that is not fully market oriented. And the only way that we're going to be successful at getting them to, in some ways, change their approach to that is if we do it together. I recognize that there are concerns with regard to taking actions because people are worried about the response. But ultimately, my view is that if we don't think over the long term about what happens if that economy is allowed to grow and continue to take steps that are anti-competitive, that make it harder for us to compete on a level playing field, we'll end up with a system in which all of our economies suffer. So I think that if we can do those three things, deepen our relationship with regard to what we do, to address climate. 2 is Europe's focus on establishing a deepening a capital markets union. And 3, a shared understanding and being willing to take shared actions when it comes to countries that are not competing on a level playing field. I think those are the places where we should be focused at the moment. But I will posit, and then I know that I have to go, but that our relationship today with the European Union, in my view, is stronger because of our shared commitment to those values. I think that one of the things that has surprised President Putin the most has been how strong Europe has been. The idea that across 27 countries you have been able to take the actions that you have taken, and the fact that after he cut off and weaponized gas, your country was willing to continue to stand and to be innovative and creative, I think surprised him, and it impressed me. And I think that we remain impressed by the fact that you continue to be committed to those shared values, and we want to continue to be your partner in that. So I can't thank all of you enough for taking the time to join me today, but I can't thank the German people, German companies for the work that they are doing to continue to support those shared values. And as I said earlier, I've been to Germany more than any other country in this job for a reason, because of the importance of that relationship. And I look forward to seeing you the next time I'm here.
Thank you, Wally. Thank you, Wally. It was a great pleasure having you and hope to see you soon again. Thank you and all the best. Könnten Sie noch einen Moment warten?